Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hey, it's Jer Stays. This is a special election edition of your Daily Detroit. It's a little bit different than usual. We're not going to go into a bunch of produced stories. We're just going to have a conversation unpacking what's happening. To give you guys an idea, it is Wednesday, November 4th at 3:20 p.m. that we're recording this. I'm only putting that out there so we kind of have a mile marker, if you will, as to when this conversation is happening. Wanted to get this in your feeds before drive time today. And joining me to help sort everything out, and there is so much, is my old friend Steve Freese. He is a contributor at Newsweek and the news and features editor at Our Magazine. First, sir, welcome back.
Hey, how are you? We're going to solve it all.
Right, we're going to be two guys on a podcast with our large opinions. Go figure.
In a half hour or so, those of you listening, you'll know everything. You can put away your phones.
Well, if you can't hear the sarcasm in our voices, like, where do we even begin? I assume we should talk about what's happening overall and the presidential race first.
Oh, was there a presidential race?
Right? You know, that thing?
What happened is, on the one hand, the polling was not accurate. And on the other hand, the media's insistence and repeated reminder that the election would not be over on election day because of all of the mail-in ballots was actually correct. So oddly, the punditry was right and the data was wrong, which is weird.
Yeah, very weird. And that polling was a pretty big miss. There were areas that were more on than others, but like there were a lot of misses. There was, I think some people are saying there'll be about a 6% count miss in Michigan. Over in Maine, Senator Susan Collins was down by 6 points in the polls, but she won significantly by a comfortable margin. I mean, all over the place here, the polls did not match what happened at the actual polls.
Yeah, and I don't know the underlying reasons for that. You would have thought they would have fixed it, and I was myself sort of tentative about buying into what they were saying, but then at the same time, there was so much data and it was so consistent in one particular direction that I mean, you can be forgiven for buying into it this time. It's one of these things like, next time, I don't know. Next time it's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. In this case, shame on you too. But maybe next time, I don't know. I don't know how we in the media or in the country gauge what's happening in an election when we don't have any way to statistically model it.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, first off, there was a lot of turnout and a lot of people turned out to vote. Like, people thought that maybe Trump's second race here would mean that people did not show up. All the things that were happening, that there'd be voters that would just stay home. That was not the case at all. Now, as we mentioned in the pre-show, Joe Biden has gotten the most votes of basically any presidential candidate, but number two is going to be Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And both sides turned out in a big way. And then I think the second thing I think about, as somebody who, I know you focus on local plus national, I focus so much on hyperlocal. So much of the polling data for so many issues and races here is scant to non-existent because of the decline of local media that we don't really have. I mean, a good poll takes time and it's expensive, and those resources just aren't being spent on that kind of data.
That's interesting you say that, because that is one thing I've been thinking about today, which is the district level polling did not exist. I mean, we had some very important congressional races in this state. The Upton race, the Slotkin race, the Haley Stevens race. There were no public polling on it. Like the local newspapers didn't do it. There was nothing. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where you would have been able to detect that these numbers aren't exactly making sense. And the thing that's interesting is that, I don't know if you remember, but Alyssa Slotkin spent a lot of time in September and August telling everybody that what she's seeing on the ground is not what the polls are showing, that she did not see this groundswell of disgust against Donald Trump. She saw a surprisingly stable race, and she thought that she could be in trouble because Michigan State students were not home. So she went out trying to find other voters. But she must have also had data. She must have also had some polling internally that was telling her these things that we couldn't see.
There was an echo of that in the Peters campaign, too, in the campaign communications and things I was able to garner. They were very clear that this is a very tight race, and email after email. And I'll be honest, like on this very show, we talked about a closing poll a couple of days ago that showed a much wider gap. And the reality is that as we're recording this, John James could still win this thing.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of stunning. I mean, it goes back and forth, and that's the thing. I don't want to call it at this point because it is even closer than the Donald Trump-Joe Biden contest here in Michigan. But that goes to that just greater polling question. I think also listening to what I know that some of my contacts are saying, listeners, social media, although Joe Biden may end up winning this race by the election side, by no means was this a moral victory for Democrats that I think some strong blue supporters were looking for.
I don't know that it's a blue thing, actually, because there were an awful lot of constitutional conservatives, the whole Lincoln Project, all those people who made those videos for Republicans, voters against Trump. There were an awful lot of people whose only motivation was a repudiation of what they found disgusting about Donald Trump. Those people also had a great expectation that this was not really who we are as a country. And sadly, they may have been mistaken. Now, again, remember this, though. This is interesting because in 2018, around this point, right after the midterm elections, it didn't look very good for Democrats. Like, it looked okay, but this notion that, Democrats had done really well and there was some repudiation in the voting against the Trump administration, that seemed to be debunked. And Trump was running around tweeting that, the polls were wrong, so on. And as the votes got counted over the course of the next 2 weeks, it turned out that it was actually a pretty big blue wave, and there really was a groundswell against the president. Now, I don't know if that is going to happen the same way because it's not district by district. And my prediction is that Biden will win. It's possible that he does better than 270, which is apparently what what he might be up against right now. There's a lot of discussion that, there are a lot of votes in Pennsylvania that could actually topple Trump there. Think about that for a second. If we spin ahead 2 weeks and it turns out that Biden was elected and his electoral margin was bigger than Trump's was, and his popular vote count was bigger, then we might be thinking a little bit differently because of the fact that there was not the same repudiation of the Republican Senate. See, the Republican Senate appears to be intact. So what does it mean if the country rejected Donald Trump but kept the Republicans in the Senate? Does that mean anything? I don't know, but it's interesting.
And then on top of that, a number of House races ended up being much more of nail biters than anyone expected them to be. And it really makes me think, if COVID wasn't a thing, how much different would this race look? It makes me think about strategy. It makes me think about the lack of ground game. When I've been talking to sources all day today, it's going back to that lack of ground game by Democrats. Could there have been a way for them to safely, through COVID, do a ground game because Trump did a ground game, right? Whether it's door knocking, all that other kind of stuff, because that's just a big hole in what's happening for Democrats. I'm just kind of sitting here going, there's all these variables, but I don't think anyone expected what we got.
No, I don't think so either. Although, I mean, I don't think anybody expected what we got based on the polling and the media rhetoric over the last, say, month and a half. But if you go back to right after the conventions, this was pretty much what we were looking at. We weren't seriously thinking that Georgia, well, maybe North Carolina, but we weren't seriously thinking that Georgia was going to flip. We certainly didn't think that Lindsey Graham was in any kind of real danger or that Kansas would go to a Republican senator. So we didn't think those things. We thought that, and we wrote about over and over again, it's going to come down to these Midwestern states. What I find kind of illuminating and surprising is that we've all been walking around for a long time now saying it could come down to Pennsylvania. And at this stage, it looks like it may not. Pennsylvania may turn out to be an extra for Biden, or it may give Trump a stronger claim that it's essentially a tie. But it looks like there was another path, and the other path was Arizona.
It seems like there's some adjustment on the Republican side, too, because there are a number of challengers trying to get into the TCF Center as we are recording this. Right now, the TCF Center is kind of locked out of new people because of the COVID social distancing restrictions. And then I'm also getting texts about 200 people being outside of the state offices here in the city of Detroit in the News Center. And it seems like there are people moving in. Last night, there were about 60 Republican challengers that came in kind of late in the game going, oh, I wonder if this is where we actually need to have this counting debate and not as much Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's true. Now, the fact is that Wisconsin and Michigan have behaved pretty much the way we thought they would. I mean, in terms of the fact that Trump did pretty well on the day of and not as well in the mail-in. And that's going to be the point of contention. And there's going to be a lot of lawsuits. And in addition to that, there will probably, and this is the terrifying part, there is going to be unrest. You can't have it this close. In our era, with all of the conspiracies and anger and suspicion and fake news, you can't have it this close and think that enough of the country is going to be satisfied by whatever the results are. It was this close in 2000.
Yeah.
It was literally this close in 2000. And I think because it was such a new experience and because both candidates were very dignified about the whole thing. And Al Gore made great efforts in the wake of the Supreme Court decision to not make it about himself and to insist that the country understand that this is how the coin fell and George W. Bush is going to be the president and I support him and you need to too, and we need to get back together for the sake of the country. That is not going to come out of Donald Trump's mouth. It would have come out of Joe Biden's mouth if the situation called for it, but it will not come out of Donald Trump's mouth. In fact, one of the things that one of my sources told me yesterday or the day before that I thought, oh, that's crazy, and now I think is probably definitely going to be the case, is that if Trump is forced to accept that he has lost the election, he will turn around and announce his candidacy for the presidency in 2024. We will never get rid of him.
Oh.
It will keep going. And we will not be able to just ignore the ex-president who's tweeting crazy stuff over here, like we thought we were going to be able to.
I'm speechless to that, but that does actually make a ton of sense because as long as he's active and available to be in the scene, it's really clear there's no way that he's stepping off the stage. So he could leave the White House, but definitely not leave the conversation. And he's got the supporters to do it. One of the things I will mention here as we are recording this, John James has now pulled ahead of Gary Peters by a good almost 20,000. And we're coming at the last 2% of the vote here. So it's a real nail biter. And that makes me think if Trump loses Michigan, but wins John James, wins the Senate seat, what does that mean? Do we know? Is it just an enigma?
The fact of the matter is that Gary Peters did very little until election year to make sure people knew who he was. He became senator and he has lived this sort of anonymous life. From what I understand, he's been effective as a legislator and perhaps as an advocate, but it's politics and politics is show business. And you can't just say, well, I was working so hard and I wasn't trying to make it about me. No. You are the brand. You have to put yourself out there and you have to remind people constantly what it is you have done for them. And Gary Peters shows up in election year having to essentially start from the beginning telling people who he is. And he's their senator. These are the things that go on. I mean, John James is a very good campaigner. I was very unimpressed by his advertising. I didn't understand it. It wasn't very good, I didn't think. But I don't know. I think that a lot of this has to do with how COVID changed the way campaigning went on. I mean, one of the things you never saw during this campaign, near the end, you did see some rallies and things like that. But what you never really saw like Gary Peters on stage with Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. You never saw any of these Democratic candidates that were running for the Senate in person with their candidate. And you didn't see that much of it on the Republican side either.
But listening to Democrats out that way, I think there's also like a lot of frustration because he is a wonk. I've had a discussion with him. We've interviewed him in the past a while ago, a few years ago. And one of the things that strikes me is that he is a true policy wonk. Like, he's really into all of those details. And whether you agree with them or not, he cares about like the details of his work. But the reality is in this social media age, you've got to be out there. And this goes back to that idea I was talking earlier about that ground game. And that ground game didn't really exist that greatly under Hillary Clinton either. This is kind of a problem in general since Obama. And I wonder if it's a question of, do better candidates that know how to reach people need to be fielded for office going forward?
By the way, you said that there were only about 2% of the vote left to count. And it's, from what I can see, there's at least 6 or 7%. And that 6 or 7% is big. It's a lot of votes in the very places where Gary Peters is hoping he can pull it out. But I do find it interesting that it looks like there's a good 300,000 people who voted for the president but didn't vote for the Senate race.
Wow, that's interesting.
Just doing some quick math so far, there's 5.2 million votes cast in the presidential race. And yeah, there's about 5 million. So yeah, it's a lot.
That is a lot. And that's interesting. Just to give people context, I'm looking at the NPR site right now, National Public Radio's tracker. But all of these places have different percentages for, everyone knows that, right? You go to different media outlets, and different outlets, their decision desks have broken in different ways for this election, which I think to a lot of normal people, that's really frustrating. I hear that a lot from the non-political junkie listeners who go, it's all over the place and it feels very disheveled to the person who doesn't follow this in and out and say gets into this the last week and kind of a week afterward.
Well, it is interesting. My husband texted me about 4 hours ago and said, why hasn't anybody called Arizona yet? And actually, the folks that did call Arizona and got a lot of heat for it was Fox News. Last night, they called Arizona for Biden. And it was like, how could they do that? I think he's going to win that state. It seems pretty likely. But even now, I just went to your NPR site to see what was going on there, and they've called Wisconsin for Biden, but I don't think they've called Arizona for Biden yet.
Yeah, that gets that whole idea of, depending on who you look at, where we're at, and that's why we have to really just count all of the ballots. Speaking of ballots and vote totals, I know one of the things that you wanted to talk about was that fake Michigan vote total meme that's been going around. And it kind of drove me crazy. You want to get into that a little bit?
I do, because I think we're going to hear a lot about it, and we may never not hear about it. And I don't know what to do about it. And I'm on the Twitter sitting there saying, this is obviously fake. It's very, very clearly fake. Yet it is taking off, and this is how these things go. You know, somebody created a screenshot mock-up that basically pulled information off of, I think it's the New York Times website, and claims that they had a screenshot of the vote totals for the Michigan race from, I don't know, like 4:20 in the morning. And then at 4:23 in the morning, all of a sudden, there was 100 and, it depends on which version of this you're looking at, but 138, 150, there have been different numbers. All of a sudden, there's a 150 something thousand additional votes for Biden, while none of the other totals have changed. So the conspiracy is, how is it possible that they counted 100,000 votes in a row for Biden? No, that's not really what happened. And the other thing about it is, you would have to know, you're on your computer at 4 a.m. watching this stuff, right? You just happen to take a screenshot of this one state's vote totals at 4 a.m. and then 3 minutes later, the scandal of all scandals just unfolds in front of you. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's absurd.
Well, and it's very much not true, because if you look at the Associated Press data overnight, you're looking at, say, around 11 o'clock all the way up to, I would say 7 in the morning. In that window, Trump actually outperformed Biden on the vote count all overnight.
Oh, well, yeah, that's the point they're trying to make. This fake thing is that there was some like shift that took place within a few minutes,
and there wasn't.
And no, there wasn't. And then it's interesting because, like, Eric Erickson, who's a right-wing pundit who's generally kind of a bad person, he's been sort of on the Twitter saying, "Hey, people, calm down. We got to count all the votes." Da 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 da. He made some comment on Twitter that, the reason why the votes haven't been finished counting is because people had to go to sleep last night. And so the conspiracy theorists have taken that and said, well, how could the votes have changed at 4 a.m. if everybody in Michigan was asleep? Which none of that's true. But you start to see these like competing, interweaving conspiracies. The whole other one about, that Trump started last summer that wasn't true at the time, and it still isn't true, that the Michigan Secretary of State had sent out absentee ballots to everybody in the state. Now, you and I live here. We know that didn't happen. we know that we got letters from the Secretary of State inviting us to ask for an absentee ballot on account of COVID. We didn't get a ballot. We didn't get a ballot if we didn't ask for it. But this is all part of the kabuki that makes it all suspect and ugly. And I imagine we'll see some of it from the other side, I guess. I mean, the other side being the liberal side, I suppose. I don't know. I think it's interesting that Trump is already demanding a recount in Wisconsin. And we haven't discussed this yet, but they've already filed a lawsuit in Michigan to stop the counting of the votes. And 4 years ago, when there was a recount unfolding in Wisconsin, there was a screed of, how they always say there's always a tweet? There's a lot of tweets from President Trump, then the candidate, talking about how unfair and how wrong it is for the Democrats. It wasn't even Democrats, it was the Green Party, to pursue these recounts in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan. So the same thing that they were upset about 4 years ago, today it's all right.
I think that's part of what turns off a lot of people, though, because there is no ideological consistency except for if your ideology is whatever you think is going to benefit you in the moment.
Sure. I mean, and that's manifestly seen by what went on with the Supreme Court and the nominees in the Merrick Garland versus the Amy Coney Barrett thing. But I think one of the differences is that, like, I think people on the left are fine with a recount in a very close election like what's happening right now. I think it's probably a good idea to recount Wisconsin, Michigan, and any other state where the fate of the entire country rests, and it could be a point. I think that recounts in those cases will probably satisfy an awful lot of people who are suspicious.
Well, there was that tweet by former, I think it's Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who talked about how it's less than 1,000 votes. If it's less than 1,000 votes, a recount is not going to get you anywhere, because you're going to end up being in a situation where at most you'll have a couple of hundred votes that are off. And if you're any more than 1,000, if you're talking about a gap of 20,000, 30,000, you're not going to find that in a recount.
No, I mean, the upside of a recount, though, is that what you can do is reassure the public that the votes were fairly counted. If the numbers come out very close to what the machine tabulated and all the rest of it, well, then we know that it worked out okay. Now, we should talk about this because this is very important, and this is the thing that a lot of people in Michigan are going to hear about a lot, I think, coming up. Michigan this year started doing a pilot program known as a risk limiting audit. We did it in select places during the primaries, the presidential primaries. And the idea here is that you don't have to recount the entire state. You can do a statistical model that recounts certain areas. Now, the idea here is that this would be something that would go on every time, not necessarily just because it's very, very close, but just because it's a good idea to make sure that the machines were being honest, that the machines and the vote tallies and the actual paper are in some universe together. And so what normally would happen, even if it was like a 10-point spread, is that there's a statistical process by which a certain number of votes, ballots around the state would be selected essentially at random and checked and counted again. And if that count was statistically consistent with what the machine ballots said, then we know that everything was pretty much kosher. But if it's not, if it's off, then you keep going. You pick another, I don't know how many thousand ballots to select at random and check on. So that was already planned to happen in Michigan this year. Now, I don't know if they're going to bother to do that if they have to do a full hand recount too. I don't know. And I think they probably will end up having to do a full hand recount if the results remain this close.
One thing that might also impact is that what does Republican Party politics look like going forward? And what does the state look like going forward? You kind of posited the idea that even if John James isn't successful as a senator, it's that he could be a leading force in the Republican Party. And do you think he'd be the kind of person who would go up against Whitmer in 2022?
Oh, I think it would be a no-brainer. I don't necessarily think that just because he's been so successful against Gary Peters that he would necessarily be successful against her. I think that John James had a pretty good run against Stabenow, although not as close as everybody said. He did lose by like 7 or 8 points, but she didn't even campaign. So he basically had no opponent the first time and he lost. This time he's got a sort of a cipher of an opponent who isn't a very good politician, and he may yet win, as you said. But if he doesn't win, I'm sure that he will feel like, well, I got that much closer, and and everybody knows me, and I can garner all this. There really isn't any other Democrat in the state. There isn't any other Republican in Michigan who can claim to have gotten as many votes in statewide races as John James. He well outperformed Bill Schuette in 2018 as well. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that it would make a lot of sense for him to run against Whitmer in 2022. I also think that Whitmer is a much better politician. He's a really good campaigner, and she's a very good politician, and people do seem to like her. So, you know, he's back to essentially running against somebody who's very popular after having lost twice. I don't know.
Well, we talked a bit about Alyssa Slotkin. Another candidate you followed too is Haley Stevens. Both of them ended up winning their races, but they ended up closer. What do you think happened with Representative Stevens?
I actually don't think that she's that good a politician. You know how I didn't think that John James's commercials were all that great? I found Haley Stevens' commercials to be sort of stilted and off-putting as well, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I don't know. I don't know why, but you know, Alyssa Slotkin, I mean, she looks like she's going to win by 3-4 points. That's about the same as what she got 2 years ago. I haven't looked actually to see what Haley Stevens' margin is, but she won, I think, by 7 in the wave year. Yeah, she's up by about 2.5 points, and they haven't called the race yet. So I don't know. I don't think that her opponent was all that great. You know, I mean, I don't think that he was a particularly compelling figure who could, you know, put her on her heels. So I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2 years if both Alyssa Slotkin and Haley Stevens win. And if Biden wins, and maybe there's a you know, sequel to the Tea Party coming, the Trump Party, you know, with their tiki torches.
Also, I wanted to note for people that Elizabeth Welch won her race in the Michigan Supreme Court, and that's going to give Democratic nominated justices a 4-3 majority starting in 2021. And that's important because of some recent decisions, but I wanted to make sure to note that one. A couple other things I would note is that Oakland County seems to be securely blue now with 100% of those precincts in. Joe Biden actually got 95,000 more votes than Hillary Clinton, and 3 out of 4 county offices went Democrat. So an area that was a Republican stronghold for a really long time is now blue. And then Macomb County expectedly went red, but Trump's performance was about the same as before. But I would note that their county commission went Republican. And I know it's an extremely nerdy thing, but I wanted to get in. Those are a couple things that I noticed. And I also wanted to get your idea of what is your bold take? What are something we need to think about in the next coming days?
I think we're heading for a lot of drama and dissent. And I wish that people could take a breath and trust the system. The problem is that the system has been undermined. The reputation of the system has been systematically chipped away at by the president of the United States over the last 4 years, plus even before he was elected. And it's now all coming home to roost. This whole question of whether we trust our election results, and even if we can't quite trust them, whether we swallow them, which is what we did in 2000, which is what we did in 2016. The fact of the matter is that the Republican Party, with this election, no matter what happens, the Republican Party will have lost the popular vote in this country every election, except for one for the last 30 years. That's a long time. I mean, they haven't, other than George W. Bush's reelection, the last time they won popular vote was 1988. So, that tells you something about what's happening in our country as well. The fact that we do see some changes going on here. We do see that Texas is trending, just not quite there yet. And Georgia is shifting, and maybe it's there yet, maybe it's not. But at the same time, Florida is going sort of the other direction. So, I mean, there are definitely changes happening in this country that we can't anticipate. I just worry a great deal about how we move forward. The fact is that the Republicans won the 2016 election, and the Trump supporters and Trump himself never quite seemed to internalize that. They behaved for the last 4 years as if they had lost that election. They complained about it. They complained about their victory. So what do you think is going to happen when they lose? Yes, there were a lot of people on the left who were skeptical of how the 2016 election happened, particularly given that the intelligence community said that there was interference. Whether there was collusion or not, there was interference. And we haven't even heard about that yet. We haven't even started to unpack what kind of foreign meddling went on this time. We know there was some. We know there were efforts to do so, but we don't know what yet. So we have a lot more fodder, a lot more grist for the mill coming over what happened here. And this country is a long, long way from healing. You and I are too young. We weren't born during the McCarthy era, right? And so we read our history books, and we learned in school about McCarthyism, and the story was over. I mean, the story had a beginning, middle, and end. There was this Red Scare, and we were afraid of communism, and there was this opportunistic senator, populist demagogue who scared everybody for a long time and built up a whole bunch of power, and then suddenly somebody sat at a congressional hearing and just stuck a pin in him, and the whole thing just deflated, and we went on with it. And that's the story. And McCarthyism bad. And I've wondered all this time, like, how did it really happen? Like, how did we really get past a period where we were blacklisting people, where all kinds of public employees and artists and politicians, were shamed into being ostracized from their industries? I mean, think about the magnitude of what went on during McCarthyism, and I don't really know how it ever got resolved. And I feel a lot like that now. Not that it's the same thing. It's not exactly the same thing, but I feel like we're in a dark period like that. I feel like we're in a period where we are really questioning the fundamentals of what it means to be an American, and what law and order is, and what justice is, and how these systems work. And boy, it's going to be hard work, however it works out. to get back to anything close to what we thought of as conventional politics.
I guess to add to that, I can't express enough the amount of fear and worry among my family and friends that are people of color that are of any sort of minority group right now, who feel like many of them knew that the country had this potential and was this way. And to have that reinforced, and then for some folks who are new to this game, new to the disenfranchisement game, for them to kind of wake up and go, oh, this is how it really goes. And yes, like a huge amount of people are completely fine with co-signing on the last 4 years. I think to them, it's something where, well, of course Trump would have lost by X, because how could he? Well, he could. And I feel like we need to do some real soul searching around who we actually are as Americans. That healing, that point that you're talking about of like, what does it mean? What does law and order mean? What does social justice mean? What does equality mean? And how much as a country as a whole do we value these ideals? Or is it really just about the pocketbook and that people value their personal finances? They've made this calculation that they're going to be better off under folks like Trump, and the other stuff secondary. Those are questions that I think that a number of people think that they know the answer to, but when it comes to the wider American population, to be honest, I'm not sure that we're not in this period for a really long time, because I don't think it'll just be conversations. I think it's going to be a really difficult 4 or 8 or 12 years up ahead. And maybe we just need to gird ourselves that this is normal now. And I know that's really terrifying for segments of our listeners. Other folks, they're going to think this is great. I mean, nearly half the state. But that conversation needs to be bridged somehow. Otherwise, we already have horrible divisions within our country. And I feel like, to me, what I worry about is this McCarthyism, or is this 1850s America before the Civil War?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I will say that we maybe aren't giving, I don't know if it's going to sound bad, but maybe we're not giving Donald Trump and his rather unique genius, talent, enough credit. This is not where we would be if he had not been running for president. We would have maybe had like a Jeb Bush candidate. The 2016 election would have been, nasty, but it would have been leaking emails and grabbing the blank, and it wouldn't have been all these other things that happened with Trump. He is a singular figure and agent. He is a person who somehow has convinced an awful lot of people to go to events that could kill them in the middle of a horrible pandemic. And he has said awful, crazy things that very few other people would have ever said, because they would have been too ashamed to say them. They would have been run out of politics if they had said them, because they would have been normal people, normal type of politician. So I'm not saying it's all about Donald Trump, but I do think that the stability of his support is unique to him. I think that if he had stepped away and Mike Pence had run in his place this year, I don't think Mike Pence would have come nearly as close as Donald Trump. I there's something about him that excites enough different type of people, rebels, and we are Americans, and we do think of ourselves as rebels. That is sort of seen as a virtue, and so if you see yourself as a rebel by going up against, by supporting somebody like Donald Trump, then I don't know. I mean, yes, we have a lot of work to do in this country, I will also say that Florida would not have gone for Donald Trump if not for the Hispanic vote that went to him. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the Democrats lost 2 Democratic seats in Miami area.
And then there's the detail that we need to look into, and maybe this is important back to the polling conversation. There is that detail of Hispanics are, how they perform in voting is definitely different depending on where they came from. The Cuban situation is going to be very different than what you're seeing in Arizona or what you're seeing out west. And we need to get more granularity to understand what that is, that I think a lot of the mainstream media is kind of missing right now. Like, there's a whole bunch of granularity in lots of ethnic groups that is just being completely missed.
Hey, Jer.
Yeah.
According to the New York Times website, Gary Peters just pulled ahead by 10,000 votes.
Hey!
So, I mean, by the time you post this thing, Valerie Willis, who's the third-party candidate, maybe she'll win. Who knows?
I think that's where I'm going to leave it, Steve. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate the invitation all the time. Sure.
All right. That was Steve Freese. You can find him on Newsweek, Our Detroit, also at Steve Freese on Twitter. A few quick post notes. Number one, press outlets have called the race in Michigan for presidential candidate Joe Biden. Gary Peters very narrowly won his race against John James, and both Alyssa Slotkin and Haley Stevens, the representatives in suburban districts of Detroit and stretching to Lansing, they both won their races as well. All right, that'll do it for this episode of Your Daily Detroit. All week, we're going to be diving into different corners of what's been happening with this crazy election, as well as everything happening around the region. I got to note, there were more than 4,100 COVID-19 confirmed cases today. This is not a story that we're going to leave alone. There's a lot more happening than just the election, so expect a lot in your feeds. We're going to do the best we can to be with you. And, of course, thank you so much for listening to all this. We really appreciate you. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other. Now see you around Detroit. Talk tomorrow.